Hello, welcome to the spring season in the year 2021. And today we are going to talk about addictions, a pretty heavy topic generally. And I will start by my claim that everyone is addicted. And we are addicted in a spectrum, in different layers. Some of us may have a strong external material addiction, like say alcohol or drugs. And then we have a spectrum whereby there may be other smaller forms of material addictions like sugar, chocolate, or fried food, and things of that nature. And then we would move into more of emotional and intellectual addictions. We may have addiction to our identity, to our views, especially political, religious views. We may find comfort in our intellectual habits of how we think we are to the world, what we even hold very strongly as our values, often can be a form of addiction. And we may have emotional addictions where different people may have gotten themselves in some form of a pattern where they like to or feel comfortable in a specific emotional state. And this need not necessarily be pleasant. Some people may be addicted to anger, others may be addicted to sadness, depression, and then there may be people who are addicted to some form of pleasure seeking. On the other hand, say lust is another one, which is quite common in our culture. So we have that spectrum. And then we have physical addictions where people may be addicted to a specific physical pattern, the way they hold their body, the way their posture is held, the kind of exercises that they do. If they stimulate themselves physically, say with a massage or through sexual activities. And eventually what happens is you end up having these collections of addictions which get formed around your ego structure, and our experience of the world is then oriented around either avoiding a trigger that takes us into that pattern, or to distract ourselves from that uncomfortable feeling by falling into a pattern of addiction. So at a fundamental level, my understanding is that this addiction is arising from a deficit and a disconnection. And the disconnection is, at times we can say it's disconnection with others, but it need not be. I feel it could be disconnection with our passions, let's say, what we actually feel we are called to do. We may be disconnected from our clarity, our sense of direction, and we may be distracting ourselves by going on the internet and consuming a lot of information to find that direction. We may be disconnected from our own solitary intimacy, and then we may be going out and seeking relationships and socializing to distract ourselves from that. It feels like these initial disconnects have a solution that is out there in the world. And so we're trying to go and find that solution. But a lot of the times the solution creates a negative feedback loop in the long term. So if I lack clarity, rather than sitting in that lack of clarity with the unknown and allowing my being to synthesize that ambiguity and emerge with a clarity, what I end up doing is I might go into Twitter, I might listen to a few podcasts, I might read books, I might interact with many people. And in essence, I'm trying to reduce that lack of clarity. But more often than not, this activity only increases my confusion and in turn fuels a desire to find clarity even more, which seeks a lot more information, and I get stuck in this feedback loop which has no solution. So the response in one way is to just take a pause and stop the conversation and say, I'm going to sit with this unknown and see what emerges. The same actually emerges in terms of our interpersonal connections as well. When we feel disconnected from our own body, heart, and mind, we end up seeking others constantly for some form of reflection to feel a level of intimacy. And this might manifest as seeking relationships, seeking physical connection, seeking distraction through media, which is, I think, a very common way of finding company. One may want to listen to different podcasts, watch videos, watch movies, just so one feels that they're surrounded by some form of intimacy and they get to interact in that particular way. I think this has become quite apparent during the year 2020 with the pandemic and a lot of lockdowns, people spending a lot of time on their own. I always think that a way to gauge your health is to see how skillfully and peacefully you can exist in a room without doing anything. How relaxed, how comfortable, how whole do you feel? Or do you find yourself filled with these holes with an edge where you're constantly seeking to fill them from some form of input in the world? So to synthesize what I have been articulating, the essence of addiction is a disconnection with our presence, our true nature, our dynamic aliveness. And when we are disconnected with that thread, we are calcified into these patterns of behavior, which may then be attempted to fulfilled, or itches that we may want to scratch using media, information, emotions, thinking, food, substances, and activities. So what is the response? I think the first thing we have to say is putting the entire weight of the addiction on the individual is unhelpful. And this is how a lot of the Western civilization is oriented with its myth of individuation. Everyone is expected to manage everything on their own. But I feel that there are deeper and larger forces in the environment which are constantly sitting to trigger your addictions. The internet is one, the advertising is another. The entire advertising industry is built around touching the different deficiencies which you feel and creating a sense of discomfort, so then an ad or a product can be made a solution for. So you end up consuming. So this whole consumeristic culture is oriented around saying, hey, you feel something is missing, let us give you that thing, and why don't you give us your money? So we have to understand that we are playing with patterns which are very, very powerful, forces that are coming from outside, which have a lot of, let's say, power, authority, money, all behind them, right? So it's important to recognize that. And the other side of this is not just the normal world, the world of atoms. The world of bits and technology is even more oriented towards touching these threads in you. So instead of falling into the trap, how can we look at this entire consumeristic advertising industry as a place to train instead? So we want to think of this as almost like a boxing match, and instead of a training with no weight, like for instance, going into the woods and not having any distractions, how can we live in the world and be interacting with these powerful forces while not allowing them to win over us? Now, of course, this is like a gym. We don't want actually that to be our default conditions, but we should leverage our practice in a way, our skill of working against these addictions at a later stage by directly engaging with some of this powerful forces. But at the initial stages, I think the most important thing is to connect with your presence and start to subtract, start to remove things from your life and see where addictive patterns are operating. And I feel that a lot of the times we always look at them as a negative, but Interestingly enough, a lot of the things that the society considers positive also are addictions of some other form. So a lot of the workaholism, which is sort of called hard work or working ethic, a lot of the times can be driven by a sense of addiction. A lot of running and triathlons are also driven by this, where a person is addicted to the sensations that emerge and want to distract themselves from deeper underlying issues that are seeking to be looked at. A lot of the mastery in different sports where there's a level of obsession can, not necessarily, but can emerge from a sense of addiction. And I think a lot of the peak performers in the past have talked about this. I can give an example of, say, Tiger Woods or Andre Agassi, who spoke about their challenges in their training practice and their internal state of mind, which was driving it. So to summarize, I think it's important to recognize that an addiction need not always be socially bad. A lot of the things which are considered socially admirable are also forms of addiction. The essence of addiction is a sense of disconnection from presence, where we feel like we need to get something from the outside in to relax that itch. So what can you do in terms of becoming more aware of when an addictive pattern is happening? The first thing is to sense, am I feeling a sense of mechanistic rigidity rather than a sense of dynamic aliveness? So a lot of the times these addictive patterns don't have a lot of charge. They are almost like a news article or a news reporting, it's just a repetition. It's a repetitive loop. You keep doing it. You don't really examine it. It just somehow soothes you in some way, but there's a very limited amount of presence in these activities. So whenever you lose presence, there is a chance of slipping into an old addictive pattern. And our neuroplasticity is very much sometimes against us in this particular journey because we have been repeating those addictive patterns. So we have to infuse the current of presence into these neural circuits so that we can actually learn to skillfully rewire them, to reorient how they manifest in our life, and to have a very different way of responding to these kind of situations. The other element I want to just quickly mention is that the initial stages of this process, the first thing I'd recommend is just a detox. We have to not tackle all the addictions in one go. We have to pick one and then move to the other. And the best way to do that is just take a pause. So if you find yourself in addictive patterns in terms of how you relate to others, perhaps you might consider taking a few weeks of solitude and see how those itches arise and how you can let yourself feel them without scratching them. And over time, you may be surprised to find you all of a sudden don't need to scratch them. And then you can relate in a place of feeling full, of feeling whole, rather than feeling empty and then seeking to connect from a sense of grasping to the other. And this can also apply to food. You may want to fast for some time. A very good one and a very difficult one for me is working with technology. How often do I look at the screens on my phone and my computer in this period has been surprising. And it would be very interesting to experiment. Can I spend a few hours without looking at the phone? Can I go for a walk without having the phone with me, without having an audio podcast running, or without spend a few days without watching the video? One very tricky thing in this entire process is a lot of the times we end up switching one addictive pattern with another. So we might say, yo, I'm addicted to X. I will choose to something that is more healthier. So instead of watching a lot of Netflix, what if I use all that time to listen to audiobooks? Sure, that's a much more skillful response, but it's a means to an end. And eventually you have to let go of that if you actually want to have a sense of wholeness and freedom in your life. So as you can see, this is a very passionate topic for me. I have struggled with my own little addictions, from TV shows to workaholism to, at some point, eating a lot of unhealthy foods, having a lot of wine, and even patterns of spiritual practices and learning as a form of addiction. So I know it's very painful when we recognize them. Initially, we don't, and it feels very normal. But I found myself that the journey of feeling into them and letting them go has been such a beautiful journey. It's almost like taking tons of weight off the shoulder. All of a sudden, you can be relaxed in your orientation, you can be more creative, you can be more fluid. And there's a sense of, as you're getting older, you seem to be feeling younger. And so there's this beautiful youthfulness and joy that starts to emerge, almost like a child, because often children, when they're born, they're not really having any of these patterns. They're all fresh and full presence. So in a way, this is returning back to the Tao, returning back to that wholeness that we are all born with, and that is always present in us. And I wish you the best in your journey. I hope you play with some of these experiments and ideas, and very curious to see what happens for you. Feel free to comment or to just mention if you find this valuable. And yeah, thank you for your time. Take care.